John and Ken Show. John Kobylt and Ken Chiampou. We have a lot today. There's been reports all breaking out of London. All the London newspapers are all over this, and all the sissy American papers won't touch it because there's a lot of news that indicates that global warming really is a hoax and a scam. And we're going to tell you in a few minutes about Professor Phil Jones from East Anglia University in England. The Climate Research Center there was the center of much of the research used to justify all this global warming fanaticism. He now has admitted there has been no significant warming of the planet since 1995.
What do you hear how sloppy he is just in terms of keeping the data? It's unbelievable. He's
lost a lot of the most important data. He's stepped down as the director of that research institute once they broke into his email archive and found out that there was a lot of hiding the data and fudging of the data and suppression of counter-arguments. He's said now he's contemplating suicide. You know, his life work has been exposed as a scam. And he's the top guy. Him and that Indian, Dr. Rahendra Pachauri, and he's from the UN climate panel that won the Nobel Prize. They both have admitted that the globe has actually been cooling the last few years, and nobody knows why. And you know what? This Phil Jones even says that there isn't a consensus among scientists about global warming. Remember, you kept hearing that, oh, it's settled science. Don't be a denier. Well, he's saying now it's not. It's not settled science, and he doesn't think most scientists believe that it is.
Well, in our studio right now, we have a weather guy who's going to talk to us about a lot of this, but he's also going to talk to something he looked into as to whether or not the weather stations that have been put in certain places in the United States are indeed also in reliable places. His name is Anthony Watts, and he actually has a website, Watts Up With That.
Watts is W-A-T-T-S.
Commentary on puzzling things in life, nature, science, weather, climate change, technology, and recent developments.
He's also a weathercaster for a radio station in Chico at KPAY on 1290 AM. And let's have him tell us what he has discovered, because this I love. I love when one guy sets up a blog, does his own research, makes his own contacts, and comes up with something that completely undermines the consensus, completely undermines everything that's being forced down our throats.
I didn't start out to undermine anything. I was interested in paint.
What do you mean?
Well,
Paint?
I know it's crazy, but here's what happened. I'm friends with the former state climatologist of California. His name is Jim Goodridge, and he is an ultimate data guy. Unlike Phil Jones that can't find his papers, Jim has everything organized. Do you want to find the rainfall at El Toro in 1952? Bam, he's got it. This guy knows his data. And he was telling me in the mid-'90s about some of the stuff he'd found about California weather stations. And at that time, I was full tilt on the whole CO2 causes global warming and we got to do something about it. So full tilt, in fact, that I went out and got 174 TV stations around the United States in 1990 and 1991 to do a program on Arbor Day to get their viewers to plant trees to offset CO2. That's how into it I was. Okay? Mm-hmm. So Jim tells me about this data, and he shows me what's going on with California. And he did a study that showed that California counties ranked by population, the highest population counties in California had a graph that looked like going up the grapevine. And the middle counties of a population had a kind of a medium warming, and the counties that were rural had hardly any warming at all. And
the rate of warming should be the same all over the county. All over the state, rather.
And this was curious to him, and he'd also talked about something that I had discovered about these things that we used to use a lot of these all over the world called Stevenson screens. There are these weather stations that look like chicken coops. They're whiteboard, slatted boxes, and they have mercury thermometers in them, and they would be read manually, and they would write down the temperatures in a logbook, and they would do these at farms, they would do them at airports, all over the world. And they've been replaced mostly by electronic ones, but we wondered what had happened in 1979 when the Weather Bureau changed the specification on the paint for these things from whitewash to latex. Whitewash was put in place because that's when these things were built. In 1892, when the Weather Bureau was put together, that's all they had. So that was the spec, and they kept that spec until 79. So we wondered, what happens when you change the paint? So I did an experiment. I went out and I bought 3 of these things, and I set them up, and I found the historical formula for whitewash. I went to the National Lime Company in Arizona and said, what would they use for a formula for whitewash back in 1900? And they told me, and I recreated that. I did the experiment. I ran the experiment. And yes, the latex paint ones that they're using today, starting from 1979, are warmer by about a half a degree.
So the paint on the weather station would raise the temperature on the thermometer by a half a degree.
Right, because it absorbs sunlight differently than whitewash did. So
wow.
we
that
said,
basic,
okay,
yeah.
Yeah. So this was amazing, and I was just interested in this. That's all I was interested in. It was just a geek thing. So we decided,
I understand. I used to do stuff like that as a kid.
Okay. So I said, well, I got to figure out, how many stations have been repainted or not. So I went around and looked. I found one at my university farm, the Agricultural Experiment Station at Chico State University. I opened it up, and to my surprise, the thermometer was there, but a couple inches away from it, they had this radio transmitter. And that was because they wanted to automate the data collection and send it back to the Weather Service office in Sacramento. And I said to myself, well, wait a minute. Who puts electronics that makes heat a couple inches from the thermometer? It didn't make any sense.
It's not going to be an independent collection of weather data, right?
Right. Yeah. So, okay, I figured it was a fluke. I went on to another station in Orland, California. Had been there since 1889, I believe. It's a long-time station. Everything looked perfect. Everything was right. It was well done. It was sited correctly. It was on the grass. It was away from buildings. Thought it was a fluke. Then I went to the third station in Marysville, California, and this was at the fire station there. And I discovered something that shocked me. The station had been converted to an electronic thermometer instead of the ones in the chicken coops, and it looked like a little beehive. It's got a bunch of stacked saucer plates, and that's where the thermometer is inside of there. And it was on a post. And the post was right at the edge of the parking lot. And the fire chief would pull his truck in there, radiator first, just a couple of feet away from this sensor. Now, I could stand there at that sensor, and behind me were these two small buildings, and they turned out to be cell phone electronics buildings.
Oh.
They rented out space at the fire station for a cell phone tower. And, they were looking for money like every other government entity in California. And so I could stand there and feel warm air conditioner exhaust blowing on me while I'm looking at the thermometer, and I'm saying, okay, 2 out of 3 stations I visited have problems. What's up with that?
So you started looking at more and more stations and soliciting photographs from around the country.
Right.
And you found what?
I found that 90% of the stations used in the climatic network for not only for California, but for the nation, do not meet the government's own siting standards.
So 90%. And is a sample you did, or you really took a look at many of them?
There are 1,221 stations in this network. I set up a volunteer program through my blog, and we had volunteers go out and photograph these and measure distances and figure out where these stations were, because this had never been done before.
Because the global warming fanatics are claiming we have an average of 1 degree increase in temperature over the last 100 years.
Yeah, about that.
And so it seems that if you're looking at 90% of the weather stations are, let's say, compromised,
near heat sources.
That might account for a degree variation.
I think it does, yes.
Yeah.
All right, hang on. In studio with us is Anthony Watts. He's a weathercaster at KPAY, 1290 AM radio in Chico. He's got a website, too, Watts Up with that, spelled W-A-T-T-S. And he's talking to us about these weather stations that have been placed around the U.S. and the world, really, to collect the data that would ultimately, supposedly, support the climate change theories.
Right, which is relevant to all of us, because they have that Global Warming Final Solutions Act that they want to implement, which will cost us over 1 million jobs, according to Cal State professors. More coming up with Anthony Watts when we come back on the John and Ken Show. KFI AM 640, more stimulating talk radio.